For our next presentation, we are excited to warmly welcome Dr. Nathan Call, Professor of Pediatrics and Associate Chief of the Division of Autism and Developmental Health at Emory University. Dr. Call, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to make sure that my mouse will allow me to advance slides. One second. Okay. Looks like we're on track then. So I want to just first thank the Organization for Autism Research for the invitation to be here today. I was on the previous slide. There was a colleague of mine that I want to recognize, Dr. Joanna Lomas-Mevers. She and I have worked together for a long time, and she really is the brains and the brawn behind everything that I'm going to present today. She had a commitment, otherwise I think she would have been a great person to speak on this topic. I do have a couple of disclosures. I have received funding to do this work. Obviously, some of that funding is from the Organization for Autism Research, but also from the Department of Defense. And then as I get to the end of the presentation today, I have good news that there is some additional funding that is about to be received to extend this work even further from the National Institutes of Health. So this is a topic that is not always the most glamorous in the world, but is very much a reality for everyone, and that is on the topic of toileting. And it's important to have just a little bit of background on toileting itself. And first of all, we know that typically neurotypical kids generally achieve continence by around 4 or so years of age, not much later than that in most kids. However, autistic kids oftentimes achieve continence later in life, and in many cases, never at all. As many as 60% of kids on the spectrum are not trained for bladder or bowel by age 3.5, and certainly there are instances where it takes much longer than that, or kids that never do get bladder or bowel trained. And there are some big ramifications of that. Anyone who is toilet trained, any child, knows how stressful that can be as a parent or a caregiver to work with that loved one to try to get them to the point where they're fully toilet trained. And that is certainly the case for caregivers and parents of autistic children who may be struggling with toilet training. And in addition to that, not just the toilet training itself, but as a child gets older and older, and if they aren't independent with the toilet, it can have all kinds of other negative ramifications, including further stress for those around them who may deal with stigma, deal with other negative types of experiences. Certainly there's hygiene problems, and that can create discomfort, lack of independence for the individual who's not fully toilet independent. The inability to be independent in that way can really be limiting in terms of access to certain types of settings. You know, you typically can't be in a regular education kindergarten if you're not toilet trained. You can't go to lots of summer camps if you're not fully toilet trained. You can't swim in the pool if you're not fully toilet trained. So lots of things that can be really important life experiences may not be accessible to individuals who aren't fully toilet trained. There's also just a big economic burden. Anyone again who's had a child knows that in infancy diapers are really, really expensive. It becomes one of the big expenses in your family budget. That expense increases as kids get bigger, as the needs for those types of sanitary clothes increase. It continues, and as their size increases, there's fewer and fewer per package, and they become more and more expensive, and that expense can be quite burdensome. And then it's also important to know that these are not issues that generally just go away, that after a certain age, if an individual hasn't been successful at being toilet trained, this will generally persist into adulthood and be a lifelong issue for that individual. So you can't talk about toilet training, and I'm going to focus on some work that we've done with the Organization for Autism Research based on, or focusing on toilet training for bowel movements, and incontinent bowel movements are sometimes referred to as encopresis. That's kind of the technical name for incontinent bowel movements in an individual who otherwise could be bowel trained. But you really can't talk about encopresis and bowel training without first talking a little bit about enuresis, which is continence for urinations. Now, at our center, we have a clinical service focused on toilet training. The protocol that we use is pretty standard, and if you look at the references, you'll see that the Azarin and Fox paper was published in 1971. There haven't been that many changes or updates since those early days, because the fundamentals of the protocol for toilet training for enuresis are pretty consistent. Although there have been some updates, they're not all that there hasn't been that much of a change. And really, the fundamentals are similar to what might happen for any other child who's undergoing toilet training, which is you have the child sit on the toilet. You try to spot instances when they're likely to go. You sit them on the toilet. If they have if they urinate, you reward that or reinforce that with something that they really, really care about. And over time, that will eventually work for most kids. And it's not necessarily different when it comes to doing toilet training for kids who are on the autism spectrum. But there are some subtleties and some more consistency sometimes that is needed that when typical toileting approaches don't work. And so one of those things is being consistent about the sitting itself. And so for these kids that we would see in this clinic, these would be kids who were unsuccessful with toilet training. They were past the age of 5 in order to be seen for the most part. And first thing is we would have them sit very, very frequently. Instead of just looking for a child who's maybe doing the potty dance or grabbing it themselves, we would sit them on a regular cadence. That is every 5 minutes. They would sit for 10 initially. So they're sitting on the toilet more than they're not sitting at this point, right? And that's something that, again, we're really just trying to essentially get lucky at some point. You kind of have to just get lucky to get that first continent urination on the toilet so that then you can provide that powerful reinforcer, whatever is most potent or important for that child. And then over time, we would start to gradually thin the schedule of sitting. So going from a 10-minute sit every 5 minutes to a 10-minute sit with a 10-minute break, and then 5-minute sits thereafter with increasing lengths between those sits. And over time, kids would we would base this on their success rate typically. Now, it's important to know, as I said, you kind of have to get lucky that first time. You can also do a little bit to boost your luck. And part of that is what's called fluid loading, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was that we were providing pretty much continuous access to drinks so that could help with the need to go so that more of those sits would be likely to be successful when they were sitting. Had to be careful about what you're providing them to drink. No caffeinated beverages or sodas, obviously nothing too high in calories, but something that the child would like so that they were constantly drinking so that we would have more and more need to go so that we would be more likely to capture that success so that we could reinforce it. I mentioned reinforcement. Other things that we would do is we would make sure that the kids were in underwear, which is something that families typically, or some families would really not do because it's a mess to deal with laundry or cleaning up after a child who has an accident. But what we've seen is that the use of underwear is helpful because there is some immediate feedback if the child has an accident. Pull-ups and diapers these days are so effective that a child could urinate in that and not really even notice because they absorb so quickly and so effectively. And that immediate feedback of the child being wet when they had an accident was something that is important. And then the last thing that we've always tried to do, and this is also include communication training, that before we would have a trip to the toilet, we would do some prompting to have the child initiate a trip to the toilet so that over time they learned that if they emitted that communication response, then they would be taken to the bathroom. So on the right, you can see just a sample of a graph of a child that went through a toileting protocol at our center. It's a little bit complicated. Essentially, the higher up it is on the graph, the data point, the longer we went between trips. And so we initially did a baseline. The open diamonds are instances where there was an accident, so the child just had an accident on their own. The red are the incontinent voids, the open are the trips that were scheduled, and the closed are the scheduled continent voids. And so over time, once we got through a baseline, you can see the child was having lots of accidents. We went to a very short period, a 5-minute interval between 10-minute sits, and initially, again, mostly incontinent voids, and then getting to more and more no voids, and then getting to continent voids where the black diamonds start to appear. And with success, we started to increase the time between trips. And then initially, we start to see some accidents again. So we reduce, and then we go back up, and then we reduce, and we go back up. And you can kind of see that depending on the success of the child, we started to see more and more continent trips to the toilet. And we also started to see some of these blue diamonds, which are the instances where the child actually initiated a trip to the toilet on their own, either a verbal request or a card exchange, something to indicate that they needed to use the bathroom, and got to a point where we were seeing lots of success. So that's just a sample of how things tended to look in our urination training clinic. And this, again, is not something that we invented. This is long-standing. I think it's a pretty common protocol. There may be variations place to place, but nothing too special here. So one of the things that we did early on, though, is our team wanted to look at just outcomes of this clinic and this service line. And so we did what we call a consecutive controlled case series analysis, where we looked at all the graphs like the one I just showed you over a 2-year period. And over that 2-year period, we had seen 37 kids who had been referred for toileting. And we wanted to know, good, bad, different, indifferent, what were the outcomes for those kids, regardless, no matter who walked through the door. They all got the same protocol, and so we wanted to see what the success rate was for those kids. Overall, the average age was almost 8 years of age. So these were older kids, again, who had not been successful in toilet training up until that point. And what we saw was that the percentage of urinations at baseline that were not in the toilet, or sorry, that were in the toilet, was about 15%. So the vast majority of the times these kids were urinating, it was outside of the toilet, around 85% of the time. But that on the last day of the intervention, we were closer to 65% in the toilet. So we saw a big improvement, a statistically significant improvement in toileting through this protocol of toilet training for urination. So good outcomes. And again, I don't think that this is actually something that our clinical team found really rewarding. It's one of those things that we could see success most of the time. I also want to just highlight that outcome of success on the last day of the intervention it's important to note that was never just intended to be the last time we ever interacted with that family, but rather the goal was always to get the child to a point where there were enough continent urinations in the toilet that we could then hand it off to that child's family and train them up on that protocol so that they could implement that at home to see how they would do thereafter, right? So it was never the intention that these were usually 10-day admissions. And so the intent was never that we would be at 100% by the end of those 10 days. It was more about the fact that there was enough of a foundation of success that the family now would have opportunities to reinforce success at home once they were trained on that protocol. And so a couple of other points that we saw from this. First of all, urinary continence at follow-up. So this was 8 weeks later. We saw a little bit of improvement even beyond that, 68%. So they maintained, or in some case, we even had some families where continence was not as high when they left, but became better over time as the families implemented that protocol. The other thing that we saw was that self-initiation wasn't great at discharge necessarily, but continued to improve upon discharge once the families were home and implementing that protocol. Now, the thing I want to highlight that speaks to kind of how we got involved in this project that I'm going to focus on from here on was that keep in mind that protocol, we never really focused on bowel movements. If a child happened to have a bowel movement while they were sitting on the toilet, that was great, and we would reinforce that, and that was something that we'd be really excited about, and have the potty party and do the potty dance and all of the things if that was actually rewarding for that child. But it was never the target. We were always focused on urination, and that's generally because urinations developmentally typically come first from a toilet training standpoint. And what we found was that around skipped over that slide. I'm trying to get used to using this mouse remotely. What we found was that 40% of the kids were continent for bowel movements with no specific training targeting bowel movements on its own, which I think we were really interested to see that was progress that was made with no specific intervention focused on continent bowel movements. Okay, so based on this, had their toileting clinic, felt pretty good about it, and we're having good rates of success, and the data backed up kind of what our clinical impression was, which was that most of the kids that we saw were making good progress. And then something happened that I think happens a lot of places, which is we had a kid and a family show up who said, we're really glad that you have this toileting clinic, and that's great for the kids who need that, but that's not our problem. This was a young man who was continent for urination. So he was having continent urinations on the toilet, but he was having bowel movement accidents only. And in fact, this issue with bowel movements was so bad that he would get very constipated. He had to be fully sedated around every 3 weeks to clean him out because he was never having bowel movements in some cases. He was getting ready to receive a colostomy bag. The physicians the GIs who were taking care of him were going to give him a bag that he would carry around at school that carried his feces with him. And, we all know how hard middle school is for anybody to begin with, but now you talk about adding on top of that, you're going to carry a bag of feces with you, and stigma is real, and that is a real issue. And so at the time, even though this wasn't something that we focused on in that clinic, we said, somebody needs to do something about this. We're somebody. We're in a children's hospital. We work with GIs, or we can identify a gastroenterology team to work with. And so we developed a protocol in collaboration with one of the pediatric gastroenterologists in our center, or in our system, that we thought would give us our best chance of toilet training this young man successfully. So the first thing that we did was we had made sure that he was screened by that pediatric GI to rule out any conditions that could prevent successful bowel movements, right? There are some conditions like spina bifida where kids don't necessarily have control over the muscles in their abdomen that they use when they push. And if a child has some of these issues, they're never really going to be successful through toilet training, right? That's not something that wouldn't be appropriate for them. We also made sure that the constipation was addressed medically, and for this young man, it was for not all of the kids that we saw thereafter, but we wanted to make sure if there was constipation, it had been dealt with before we started any of this, because something that can happen is you can see that the muscles, again, involved in having a bowel movement can be affected by long-term constipation in ways that need to be addressed before you ever try to do toilet training. The next thing we did was we did some systematic preference assessments, very much based on the protocol we do for enuresis or urination incontinence, to identify some things to use as reinforcers that were really valuable to this young man or others that we saw thereafter. We always made sure that we went over all of the rules around, what are the contingencies, what is we're going to do. We're going to go have these scheduled sits, and we're going to have you sit on the toilet for this long, and here's the timer that we're going to use to signal when it's time to get up. If the child would stand up, we would just kind of gently prompt them to sit back down, but we're never restrained any kid on the toilet who didn't want to sit on a toilet. We would just kind of direct them to sit back down most of the time, surprisingly more often than you would think they did. We also went through a lot of antecedent changes. So some kids had real anxiety around the toilet. They'd had a bad experience. The flushing was loud and scary. And so if there were things that we could do to make that more pleasurable, we did. Other things that we had to really think about is that based on the conversations we had with the GI, it was really important that the child's feet sat flat on the floor. That helps both from a pushing standpoint, but also so that kids' circulation in their legs isn't cut off. So we wanted to make sure that we had child-sized toilets for those who needed them. And then we started that scheduled sitting routine, which was very similar to what we did for urination, but we had them sit for up to 30 minutes. And what we would do is have them sit for 5 minutes, stand for 1, sit for 5, stand for 1, and go through that routine so that they were getting a chance to stand up, get the wiggles out, make sure circulation was going and all that, but basically remaining in that toilet, in that bathroom and sitting on the toilet for about up to 30 minutes. Now, we would always give the child an opportunity to have a continent bowel movement, but, and I'll go through this over on the right, this little diagram, which will show we initially had, if a child had a continent void at any point, if they had a bowel movement, they got to go home. And one of the things that's tricky about bowel movements relative to urinations is you really only get 1 or 2 chances per day. So unlike urination, where we could do fluid loading and kids could need to pee as much as they needed to, we really just wanted to get that one success and then end the appointment. And for some kids, leaving actually was partially reinforcing itself, getting to leave and go home or go do something else. So initially, we would give the child an opportunity to sit for that initial 30 minutes with with just the types of interventions that I've talked about so far. If they had the continent bowel movement, they got to be done. If they didn't have a bowel movement, then we would administer a glycerin suppository. And I'll talk about that on the next slide a little bit. But this is addressing an issue that's specific to bowel movements, which is unlike fluid loading, where you can boost your chances for urination, there isn't really something like that for a bowel movement. And the issue can be that if a child has a bowel movement, you've kind of lost your opportunity for that day if they have an accident. And you can try to address that. And in the past, people have tried to address the odds, boosting the chances that they'll have a bowel movement while sitting on the toilet by doing things like laxatives. The problem with laxatives is they will make sure a child has a bowel movement, but it doesn't really help with the timing. The child could have a bowel movement anywhere in that 24-hour period. So the odds of making sure that that bowel movement happens while the child is sitting are quite low. And the suppository, on the other hand, usually works within 30 to 60 minutes. And so it's something that we can actually cause that bowel movement to occur and make sure that it's successful while the child is sitting on the toilet, provide that really powerful reinforcement as a result. They get to leave and go home as a result of that. We make sure that they are comfortable throughout. And so that is part of what we were doing with this particular protocol. If they didn't have a bowel movement after the first glycerin suppository, then we would administer a second. And again, our GI told us this is absolutely safe, not a concern. You can give way more than 2 suppositories in a short period of these glycerin suppositories, but we always would stop after 2 if the child didn't have a bowel movement after the second sit. And I should say we were giving breaks in between these as well. So it wasn't like sit, suppository, sit. It was take a break, administer a suppository, come back and sit down. So the overall entire clinic appointment could be up to about 4 hours. If the child didn't have a bowel movement after the second glycerin suppository, then at that point we called it a day and said we would try again the next day. So these were kids who were in the clinic 5 days per week for either a morning or an afternoon spot. As with the toiling for urinations, where we faded out the scheduled sit, in this case what we faded was the suppository itself. So starting with a full dose, and then after 2 successful bowel movements in the toilet, we reduced it to a half a dose. And then every time we saw a reduction or 2 successful bowel movements, we would reduce it by a further 50%. And what we saw over time was that the reducing the dose of the suppository. Initially, the suppository was doing most of the work, right? You would administer the suppository and the bowel movement happened, and from the child's standpoint, it seemed like kind of was happening to them. But then at a 50% dose, for many kids, they were having to start to do some pushing. And then at a quarter dose, they're doing most of the work at that point, and they're getting used to this idea of you sit on the toilet and you push, and there's a bowel movement, and it's safe, and there's nothing, and the child feels okay, and there's rewarding for that. And that was really a big part of this protocol, was to gradually fade out the suppository. Now, I want to say, as with the urination training, the parent training was really important because, again, the point was to get to a point where that child could be successful upon discharge, with the parents basically taking the ball and running with it from there. So to talk just a little bit about suppositories, because I totally understand that this was maybe not what you thought we were going to be talking about when you decided to dial into an autism presentation. These were all over-the-counter suppositories that anybody can buy. These are, you can go to your local drugstore and pick these up. You can see the brand that we use here. I'm not endorsing anything necessarily, but that's what it looks like for those who've not seen one before. According to the GIs that we work with, these don't really work like a medication in the sense that there is something that gets into the bloodstream. These instead work through just attracting water into the colon, which then can elicit a bowel movement. We had to be very, very thoughtful about how we did this and very clear and transparent with families about what we were doing. We made sure that families could always observe. They could be in the bathroom when these were administered. They could choose not to be. They could walk in anytime and see what was happening without any prior notice. And so just from giving them comfort that we were treating their child well, we also were very conscientious, or tried to be very conscious about if there were ever any kind of resistance from the child. Now, some resistance is natural. No kid really enjoys this necessarily, but anything more than any exhibition of more than minimal discomfort, we would terminate, pause, try again, and work through that if we needed to. We did not do any kind of systematic desensitization if there was resistance. After having some conversations about this, decided that we didn't want kids to necessarily be comfortable. If there was a child who had any kind of prior trauma or anything like that, we wanted to be thoughtful about not getting a child to tolerate something like this that could extend beyond just having a suppository administered to them. And so we never did anything like that. If a child had more than 2 days of lack of success at administering this, if it was needed, then we just discontinued the protocol at that point. So these are some data from the first child that we saw who's in the top panel. And you can see in this, again, like the point at which we started administering the suppository and converted from a full dose to a half dose and so on. And you can see a pretty rapid switch in his success, that we went from 3 unsuccessful bowel movements in 3 days to every day thereafter pretty much having a successful bowel movement, which was super rewarding as a clinical team to think, hey, we may have actually made a real difference in this young man's life. He may not need a colostomy bag now. This is something that was really felt very rewarding for us to just be able to have that kind of success. And we also recognized that this was probably not the only kid in the world with this issue. And sure enough, without much real looking around, we identified 2 other kids who similarly were continent for urination, but not for bowel movements. And so implemented the same protocol with them and saw similar levels of success within that roughly 10 to 20 day interval. And these results have been published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. So that led us to OAR, and we decided, look, this is something that seems to be working well, but we really want to do more around developing a protocol that has been evaluated more systematically so that we can disseminate it beyond just our clinic. Because we were hearing from families what a big deal it was for them if their child was having bowel movement accidents. So with the support of the Organization for Autism Research, we conducted a randomized controlled trial of what we were calling by then the multidisciplinary intervention for Encopresis, because it did involve our gastroenterologists and our nurses and us as well. And so this was really, at that point, a randomized trial to get some feasibility data and just demonstrate that we could study this systematically. So we had 10 participants who got the MIE, 10 who were on the waitlist control group. All of the participants had a history of incontinence. Average continence at baseline, again, was similar to what we saw at the beginning for urination, which was 13%. All of them had a diagnosis of autism. Again, average age of 8, but we saw kids as old as 16 who were not toilet trained for bowel movement at that point. The sample was predominantly male. And then we did follow-up 1 month after discharge. And so in terms of results, you can see here. So first of all, at the 2-week point, and this was a 2-week intervention, keep in mind, right? So at the 2-week point, it's important to know what our definition of continence was, which is that over the previous 7 days, then there had to be 5 out of 7 of those days with a continent bowel movement and no incontinent bowel movements for more than one of those 7 days. It's a little bit complicated, right? But keep in mind that at the 2-week mark, we wouldn't expect to necessarily see many kids be meeting that criteria for continence, because the previous 7, during the time which we were using to measure the outcome, they were still in intervention. In fact, it's for the previous 14 days, they'd been in intervention. So we didn't expect success for any kids at that point necessarily. But by the 6-week mark, where we had after discharge, we saw about 60% of kids who were in the MIE group who were continent for bowel movements, and none were for the waitlist control. By 10 weeks, we saw that 1 of the 10 kids in the waitlist group were continent, and all but 1 of the kids who were in the MIE group who were continent had maintained that success rate. We also saw that in the group who were through the treatment, that the level of independence increased, which is, again, is something that we've seen both for urination and for bowel movements, that over time, if kids are successful, many times they will begin to self-initiate as just a natural outcome of success. So we were real happy about this, and this was a great outcome. We then were able to use the success that we've achieved through our partnership with the Organization for Autism Research to get funding for a larger clinical trial. And this was funded by DoD. It was 91 kids, again, now a little narrower age range, 5 to 12. And we were comparing the MIE to a treatment that was a little more rigorous. So in the previous study, you'll recall, it was just a wait list. So kids were getting nothing, and they were being compared to kids who were getting MIE. In this new study, kids were either getting the intervention, or many of them were getting a treatment as usual, which in our case is actually probably not that usual. We felt like we wanted to have a rigorous comparison. And so those kids received both medical treatment of constipation if they needed that, as well as consultation with a behavioral person on our team who knew this protocol and would just give them some coaching to try on their own at home. What we saw, again, was that at 8 weeks, about 36% of the kids had been successful with this, whereas 11% of the treatment as usual were not. More than what we saw previously, but in general, what we're finding is this treatment as usual hasn't been super successful. We used a different outcome that was a little more holistic, that looked at parent stress. It looked at the individual data that we were graphing for each child. It looked at other measures as well, and looked at an aggregated outcome where a person who was blinded to their treatment assignments, who didn't know which group they were in, and didn't know the child personally, would look at their responses, as well as a parent interview. We would get a transcript of a parent interview, pre and post. And when they looked at the entire package of information, the parent interview, the standardized measures, and so on, they would provide a rating of success. And here again, we saw even a slightly better response on the overall rating that system provided to us. And then we also saw reduced caregiver stress and in the MIE group, and about the same in the treatment as usual group. So overall summary, again, first of all, most of the kids who go through systematic toilet training can be successful with the type of intervention that I mapped out here, but also this intervention for Encopresis compared to a treatment as usual and a wait list improved caregiver stress, as well as just increased continence for kids who were able to get that intervention. And then lastly, it's really important to note that some of the kids who got toilet trained for urine training became successful and began to self-initiate without any additional training from them. And that's one of the main focus areas of what's coming next. So we got really good news that an R01 focused on extending some of this work is going to be funded. And a couple of things that will be different in this new study. First of all, just like everything else that happened a few years ago, every study under the sun suddenly switched to telehealth when COVID came around. And so we had to convert over to telehealth for some of the participants who were in this study, and surprisingly actually had pretty good success by coaching parents through how to implement this particular intervention. And so this current intervention is going to be caregiver mediated through telehealth exclusively, so that it can be broadened out to a wider geographic population. Also, and I think importantly, this is a study that is going to be a little more systematic about how we identify kids. So first, in the previous study, we just said, look, your child has to be continent for urine, like no toileting accidents for urinations, but incontinent for bowel movements. For this study, what we're interested in doing is actually doing the toilet training for urination up front. We'll be the ones to be doing that. So we'll be seeing kids who are not toilet trained for either bowel or bladder. We'll be toilet training the enuresis kids, with the idea being we want to track how many of those kids actually do become continent for bowel movements without additional training, and compare them to kids who were not urine trained by us, who came in urine trained, because we were interested to know if a kid who is successful in urine training, what is the latency between urination and bowel training, and what is the success rate there. We want to understand the relationship between urination training and bowel training, and that's not something that's really been looked at before. And then again, we'll be looking at even more rigorous type of a control group that will include more parent education for this upcoming study as well. So that's what's on the horizon for us. But I will end there, and I think I'm roughly on time. I said I want to take 30 minutes. I think I'm there, and leave the rest of the time open to questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Call. Perfect timing, in fact. Yes. So we will go ahead and address some questions from the audience. As a reminder to all of our guests, you still can submit any questions you have through the questions pane of your control panel. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's come in so far. First question we have here is, what role do parents or caregivers play in supporting the intervention you mentioned, and how can they be best prepared to help?
It's a great question. Parents are a really important part of just about any of these interventions that we often think of as caregiver mediated. That at the end of the day, whether a child's having success in the bathroom at our clinic is not as important. It's not important, other than to the extent that it predicts whether or not they'll be successful when they go home. And so the parent training part is something that is required. In fact, if a family tells us that they're not available for parent training, then we really can't even enroll them into either of these studies or even into the clinic for urination, because they're going to be the ones to implement the protocol at the end. Now, what I will say is, for kids both in the urination training and the MIE, the level of intensity in order to kind of get some momentum behind things is more than what a lot of families can do on their own. Right? We're talking again about sit for 10, stand for 5, or take a break for 5, sit for 10, take a break for 5. That's almost continuous toilet focused activity for a child that most families are really not able to do on their own. And so we think of ourselves essentially like, let us take the hit early on, let us work with the child to build that momentum, to get to a point in that kid's training where it is more manageable for a family to be able to handle at that point. But where it gets to a point where it's, maybe you're only taking we would call a child trip train, for example, where you take them every hour and they never have accidents. That's oftentimes a really good success for a lot of families. And then if they're starting to initiate, even better, right? But if you can get to something like a once every hour sit for 5 minutes, that's usually getting to a point where families can handle that on their own with the right kind of training and with follow-up and so forth. The same thing for the Encopresis trial. And again, in some cases, we were doing it via telehealth because of COVID, and it was entirely done by caregivers just with coaching from one of our team members. So the parents are really critically important through the whole thing. I think the other part of that is just, again, having parent buy-in. Something as invasive, I guess, is like administering a suppository. We need to make sure that they're comfortable with that they are part of that process, because they're going to potentially have to do that. One of the big things that happens that we've seen, though, is as we do the MIE intervention, because the suppository is used less and less, the parents, some of them never even do have to administer it, because the child is at a trip training point for bowel movements by the time they take over. And that's great, because if the parent doesn't have to do that, that's a real success. One last thing I should say about the use of suppositories, which again, was something that we are very nervous about in some ways and want to be super conscientious about, because it is something that is not, typical. But what we found was, once we started introducing this to parents, the number of parents, the proportion who said, oh yeah, we've tried those, we've done those a lot. Like, many of the kids that we saw had been receiving these on a regular basis because they were constipated, and that was something that families were working through. And so these are kids who oftentimes were pretty familiar with what it meant to receive something like that. Parents oftentimes knew how to administer those. And so it was a little bit surprising for us, because we were really working with providers and physicians and other folks to really think through how we could do this responsibly and ethically. And then sure enough, some of the things that we were most worried about didn't seem to be as much of an issue for families, because it was something that was just part of their experience already at that point. So I hope that answered the question.
Great, thank you so much. And a couple more really great questions that I'm going to somewhat combine together here. So bear with me. I can make sure that they come through coherently. So essentially, how might this guest is asking, how might they navigate establishing relationships with professionals in other disciplines to potentially address medical and medicinal components of these processes, as well as do you have recommendations for how to implement the Encopresis protocols and or the Encopresis protocols for ABA organizations and in providing in-home services?
Sure. So I'll take the enuresis first, and then I'll kind of answer those in reverse order, if that's okay. With respect to the enuresis protocol, the urination training, again, we did not invent that. That's not anything we want to take credit for. That is something that has existed in the behavior analytic literature for a long time, going back, like I said, to the 70s. I think there have been some papers since then, including the one I mentioned that we published, that maybe provide some updates. There were some things in the original Fox and Azrin paper that I think we've kind of decided to steer clear of. Things like, more punitive type approaches, like if the child has an accident, force them to clean it up and stuff like that we've stayed away from. But overall, like the logic and much of the protocol itself are not particularly novel, not something that we want to take credit for, because those have been around for a long, long time. And I think it's the kind of thing that ABA providers should be pretty comfortable implementing with. And if they read that, and I think the LeBlanc paper or our paper have provided some updates that can be helpful on how to go about doing that. There's little variations in terms of like how you thin the schedule and whatnot, but pretty standard fare, I would say. For Encopresis, I have been asked, and other people on my team get asked, can we go implement something on our own? And we are much more hesitant to endorse something like that because it is a multidisciplinary intervention that incorporates that medical element. At a minimum, kids need to be screened medically to make sure that they can undergo this intervention. And the people doing the screening need to understand what it is that they're saying yes to, right? It's not enough to just say, I went and saw my GI and they think, my kid's okay. But I think that GI needs to be a part of a team that understands what the protocol entails, that can give medical advice, that can monitor health if there were to ever be anything that needed to be looked at. And so that level of interaction is important, and it's not enough to just say, hey, they went and saw a GI. We understand that is an impediment to people being able to do this everywhere. And so that's partly why working on things like telehealth-based solutions and coming up with other ways where we could partner with physicians in other ways so that folks can get this type of care is something that we're working through as well. We're in a situation where we're part of a children's healthcare system, a pediatric healthcare system that includes a lot of GIs. We had a GI in our building every day who initially came here to work on feeding, but we began working with them on this issue as well. And that became just a good relationship. And I think to answer maybe the root of the first question, how does one build up those types of relationships? I think with medical providers, I've not found medical providers to be anything other than super interested and invested in taking care of their patients and providing really great care. So I certainly, you hear stories about where there can be difficulty between different disciplines, not always working well together. That just hasn't been my experience. Maybe I'm just really, really lucky in that respect. But when we've approached folks on the medical side to say, hey, look, here's an issue. These are your patients. We want to try to provide something new or novel that could be really beneficial for them. Are you interested in partnering with us? We really have never had too much trouble with that.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for the excellent response. Let me just double check, see if we can fit in any more questions within time. All right, the last one that we will go with is your study. If we have a couple of minutes left, your study has shown strong success rates. If you have a response, what do you see as the most critical elements in making this interdisciplinary approach effective overall?
So I think at the individual level, we have seen some kids who, for example, have had such bad experiences with the toilet, or there's sensory sensitivities or something like that, where just getting them to even enter the bathroom is really challenging. And those are kids that we've struggled with, I think, regardless of the particular intervention. So that's, I think, one critical thing is you have to have a kid who is at least willing to sit, or with minimal coaching or with interventions to try to make the bathroom a little more friendly and a little more reinforcing. We can usually get a lot done in that respect, but if a child really has had bad experiences in the bathroom, or finds that has had some traumatizing experience, finds it very anxiety provoking, or the sensory sensitivities are such that that's preventing them, that's one of the things I think is a real barrier. And that's something that would be predictive of success. Other than that, I think the other part is that caregiver piece, like I said earlier, making sure that the parents are able to implement something consistently and getting it to a point where they're really on board enough that, and one of the things we would oftentimes say to them is, just because we haven't reached our terminal goals at the end of the admission, the goal is being very clear with them that at the end of that time that we're with their child, they're not to expect that everything is perfect, but we're on a path towards success at that point. And having families and caregivers who are okay with that, understand their role in that, I think is another piece that's really important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Call. We really appreciate your time and insight today. Once again, we really appreciate all your being with us, sharing your time, your expertise. With that, for all of our guests, we will now take a short break and share a brief message with you from OAR staff. Whether you stay with us and stay tuned or step away for a refreshment, we'll be back soon with our next session.